this episode, I've interviewed two women. Maria Rochelle, a research and education coordinator at Jackson Hole Historical Society and Museum and also my subject advisor. And Jessica Chambers, a councilwoman on Jackson's Town Council. I was again interested in their thoughts in the overhanging question, should tourism be moderated?
That's a good question. I think our economy is so heavily reliant upon tourism. I think you can't say, let's get rid of tourists. That's impossible. And as someone who has come here prior to moving here as a tourist, I enjoyed my trip. I think there are ways to manage tourism, and I think that's what the town, the county, local government could focus on, is rather than promote tourism and just say everyone come and have a free-for-all, Jackson Hole's a good time. I think there's a way to do it responsibly and do it in a manageable way. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. But I think, however many hotel rooms we have in town versus how many parking spots we have in town, those are all things that could be considered, and just how accessible our community is.
That's a tough one. Going back to what I said, we have this amazing landscape that we live in, but it's also protected, which I also have problems with this idea of protecting the place from indigenous people and Native Americans that did sort of roam freely and protect this place, but we won't go there. In other national parks, areas like ours, having public transit that goes into our parks or the area would be hugely beneficial to helping offset some of the impacts of the tourism industry, because right now you have millions of people going all over the place in their vehicles, often not single occupancy since they're on vacation, typically with at least one other person. But you have wildlife impacts, you have wildlife conflict with vehicles. That's probably our biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, that and our airport. And we're doing a destination management plan. I can't remember the exact thing, but a sustainable destination management plan, which will ideally help do exactly what you're asking about.
I also wanted to know their thoughts on the most surprising things for them while living and working here.
When I came to Jackson, I came with these preconceived notions about living in the West, living in the mountains, living in a ski town. And I had come from very blue places, sort of coastal, and I had never considered, I didn't really realize either that I was coming to such a red state. Kind of did, but I really had nothing to base my ideas on. It's a completely different culture and lifestyle, especially with ranching and mineral extraction. And so traveling around the state and being exposed to different cultures, different ways of life has really helped engender a greater understanding of the world and the country and these different states. And I think it really opened my eyes. I think I was extremely narrow-minded. And so I guess I was surprised by the fact that I was so narrow-minded. And now I just have a really great appreciation for this place and people's opinions and different way of living and appreciation for nature. And
I learn all sorts of funny facts about history working here. And one of my favorite things is we have started on our staff meetings to end them with a history fun fact. And so of all the things I've learned, they're mostly historic facts. But did you know that there used to be a ski competition in Paintbrush Canyon on the 4th of July? I recently discovered we used to play donkey basketball as a sport here. So I think there's lots of little surprising tidbits about history that I think are cool.
Just as those tidbits play into our history, does our history play into the culture?
I think there's a lot we talked about here at the museum about Jackson being a tough place to live, and it was a tough place to live historically. And so the people who made it out here were people who were willing to do what it took to make it out here, to put it simply, and not to say that living anywhere else is super easy. But But living here is really challenging. And I think that's still true today, even though we have all these amenities and all these things we can access, and it's not like we're cut off from the world. I feel like when you come here, you're like, oh, like this is kind of hard. Like all these things I didn't perceive to be a challenge. Like I don't have cell service where I live, which I think is just wild. And I have Wi-Fi, so I can do Wi-Fi calling. Anyway, but it's just one of those really interesting things, and this thread I find through time that like Jackson breeds these really hardy people. And so it's interesting meeting people who move here today. And I consider, walking 2 miles a day to be great activity and exercise. And you'll meet people and they're like, yeah, I just skied Teton Pass a few laps. But like there's still sunlight, so I think I might skin up Snow King. And it's the same mindset of people who are just go-getters. I think you have to be a go-getter to thrive here.
Does this history have an impact beyond the local community?
Absolutely. I think Jackson, we are, again, a small town, but the presence here of our national parks just automatically implies a national importance of this setting and this location. I think we took a stand early on and said this land's important. We want to protect it. We want to protect our wildlife, and that had national, global implications. I mean, Yellowstone was the world's first national park, and that's right here in Teton County.
Now here's what the seasons are like.
So summer is definitely the heavy tourist season, and from like July 1st through August 30th, life seems just crazy here, and there's millions of visitors. Every hotel's booked, every reservation at every restaurant is booked out, and then come fall, there's a bit of an off season. There's a little lull. October is actually my favorite month. I think the weather's still beautiful, but there aren't as many people here. Kids are back in school. And then things pick up in November through March with ski season. But I like ski season because most people are staying in Teton Village generally. It just doesn't seem as chaotic. It seems more manageable. When we talk about like managing tourism, I feel like ski season does a really good job. Like people are occupied and they're not waiting outside the Merry Piglets all day long. And then spring is another off season. So it's, fall and spring are really nice and low key, and then winter is good, and then summer's crazy.
I wondered what the questions both of them get asked the most based on their separate jobs.
I get asked the questions about like what's the best hike to do in the park, or what's the best thing to see while we're here, or best thing to do. And I think that's such a hard question to answer. I think it's very person dependent. Another question, I do downtown walking tours. And so we go to different historic properties in downtown Jackson, and we give a bit of the history and a bit of present day kind of knowledge. And I love when people ask, I'll talk about property values because it's really interesting to learn, for instance, that St. John's Episcopal Church, the entire property it sits on, was purchased for $87. And I tell people, I'm like, yeah, today this land is easily worth multi-million. Then people start asking about housing and like how much it costs to live here. And I'm like, great question.
What are you doing about housing? Resoundingly, what are you doing about housing? And we're doing some things, but we're not doing enough. Can we do more? Absolutely. And the public, they want to see us do more. So that's always the question.
After Jessica's answer, I asked for more information.
So for years, I was saying we're at a tipping point. We can make these decisions. We can be proactive. We can be more proactive than we currently are, dedicating more resources. And a lot of people, they just didn't take it seriously, I think. But now the whole community is witnessing COVID has essentially just fast-tracked the issue. And so now businesses, the Chamber of Commerce, the school district, the hospital, all of these people, these massive institutions, these big employers, it's like now everybody is taking notice. Going back to this idea that we tend to be reactive versus proactive, now we're experiencing that with housing. COVID has exacerbated a situation that was on its way to where we are now, but COVID has definitely exacerbated it. And so now there is this fever pitch in the community with everyone to build as much housing as fast as possible, mainly in the town. That's where we're supposed to concentrate housing, but the community seems to be resoundingly asking for housing, which many of us in the past were saying, let's build housing. People are living in horrible conditions. It's overcrowded, rents are too high, and now it's just unimaginable what we're faced with. But the positive is that the whole community seems to be rallying for this.
Now here's a fun fact from me. On December 10th, my birthday, it is known as Wyoming Day. In 1869, the territorial governor, John Campbell, signed a bill for public rights for Wyoming women, the first of its kind in the U.S. Women were allowed to vote, and although the critics said it was merely to get the population numbers up for it to become a state, it was a momentous occasion. Following that, in 1920, the town of Jackson voted for an all-women's town council. As I was interviewing a current councilwoman, I had to get her perspective.
Well, it being over 100 years ago, whenever I was running for office this last go round, and with my fellow candidate Jim Rooks, who's now my fellow councilman, he would often cite the fact that his great-grandmother was on the first all-women's council. So I would push back and say, don't you think it's time that we have another one? And I would follow that up with, we have all of these problems here, huge problems that we need to get in order with funding, with housing, etc. And when the all-women's council came to be, they cleaned up the entire town. They fixed finances, they cleaned streets, they had a new treasurer, a new sheriff, and I believe the treasurer and sheriff were also female, and they set this place on track. And so I jokingly said, but maybe not so jokingly, well, we need to have more female representation. And when I looked at the numbers, it was about, over the last 20 or 25 years, we've had 22% female representation. So right now, and that's between the two elected bodies of council and commission. Because we also do have other elected females, but they tend to be in the offices that require maybe more work: the treasurer, the assessor, the clerk, etc. Though we have a lot of women in those offices, but on the commission and the council, these decision-making bodies, it's about 22% female. Right now we have 30% because we have one woman on the commission and 2 women on the council right now. So we're actually doing better than historically we've done. But I would love for us to have an all-women council, and we have another female that's running for council. So it's possible that women might have the majority on the council after this next election. Fingers crossed. But we do make different decisions. We have a different awareness of the world, whether we're mothers, just females in any kind of department or profession. Women tend to have different experiences relative to their male counterparts.
Lastly, I thought both of them would have pertinent thoughts on the ways locals and visitors approach the area and the differences and similarities.
I don't know if I have the information to truly comment on that. I guess anecdotally, I could say that some visitors come here as consumers, and so they have a consumer mentality about this place and what they are deserving, and locals have a greater appreciation, it seems, for the community, for wildlife, the ecosystem, making sure that we're taking care of all of these pieces, because we realize that we cannot just consume. I sort of love and hate the idea of the goose that lays golden eggs, and if we don't protect that goose, we no longer have the golden eggs that this place is, the ecosystem. And then we really aren't this top tier destination that people come because of the natural world, the ecosystem, if it's been so degraded. So there's a fine balance of providing visitors with an alternative way of visiting so that it is not so consumer driven, which I think comes from other places in the country, in the world. Just the consumerism, the capitalism. Potentially the locals are a bit more holistic when they see the world, or they see the landscape, the place that is Jackson Hole.
Jackson Hole.
Oh man, I think of the way I approach Jackson Hole in the summer, and it's like such a funny thing. Like coming into town, I will like reroute how I drive around. In the winter, it's really luxurious almost to be able to drive through town square, and in the summer, I avoid town square pretty heavily, just as a general concept. It's a lot. There's a lot of people, there's a lot happening, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think there's a different appreciation for locals versus tourists of what we're looking for in a town and what we're looking to do on the weekends. And sometimes I just want to go to a movie and I don't need to go to the cowboy bar per se. So yeah, I think there's just a different approach. I do admit there is a luxury in being a local and that I can do these things whenever I want. It doesn't have to happen in a few days of time. And so I can take things more leisurely. I can hike to Taggart Lake, and that's the only thing I do all weekend. And I don't feel guilty about that because I have other normal life things to do, like laundry and cooking. Whereas I feel like if you come here as a tourist, you are trying to hit all the highlights as quickly as you can. And therefore you're probably a little more stressed. But yeah, those would be my different perspectives. Locals are more interested in how to live here long term. And usually that means avoiding traffic.
And here's Maria's recommendations for visitors.
I think the best way to approach it is, as with most things, an open mind. I think there's so much you can learn here and there's so much you can do here as far as activities, and you might think you are going to come here and see a moose, for instance. A lot of people want to come here and see a moose. But I think if you keep an open mind, there's so many other things you can see and so many other things you can learn. And if you are flexible in what that might be, I think there's a lot to take in. I think of all the wildflowers whenever I moved here and how I always thought of this place as like mountains and moose and bears. And then whenever the wildflowers came in May and June, I was blown away. They were so beautiful. And I think being able to appreciate the beauty in a variety of things is a good way to experience Jackson Hole.
After comparing the differences and similarities between locals and visitors, it prompted an interesting comparison between the two women. Both are aware, perhaps more so than other locals, of the history of Jackson and how it influences their jobs today. Yet, their perspectives were each distinct. Well, that's all for this episode. Thank you for watching, and remember, follow along in the playlist I made.